you are so much more capable than you think. The things that scare you, the things that you are afraid of, you might just be overestimating in your mind as to how terrifying they are, and at the same time, underestimating your ability to cope with them.
Hello, my beautiful friends. My name is Dr. Becc.
And I am Kristeen Barker, and this is Am I Doing It Wrong? A podcast for doctors by doctors. Dr. Becc is a mindset coach and medical doctor who specialises in liberating driven professional women from the limitations of perfectionism, imposter syndrome, and people pleasing. She's basically the cheat code for getting out of your own way, showing up authentically, and living a life you're proud of.
And Kristeen is a medical educator and nephrologist who creates resources for doctors in training that I truly think are an unfair advantage. She makes complex topics super simple and takes the pain and uncertainty out of passing your medical exams. Kristeen and I connected a few years ago via our online platforms, and over the years we've discussed countless highs, lows, and in-betweens of doctor life. And in doing so, we've experienced firsthand the power of vulnerable conversations to show us where we're getting in our own way and underestimating our capacity.
So we want you to be part of the conversation and experience these same results. Every week on the pod, we'll be bringing you conversations which shine light in dark places, normalise the doctor journey, ease unnecessary suffering, and give you actionable steps to thrive in all facets of your life. So grab a cuppa and get cozy for this week's episode of Am I Doing It Wrong? The podcast for doctors by doctors. Oh, well, hello everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the pod. How are you, Becc?
I am delightful. I'm so excited today. We just had our little chat about what we're going to talk about today, and it's such a great concept. What to do in a hard situation. I love these topics where it's like you got a tough situation, but you can make something good of it. So I'm so excited to talk about today's topic.
And so the inspiration from this topic came from a real life story that happened to me on Friday. And I'm sure many of you, especially if you have a cat, can relate to this story. So it's a typical Friday morning. I'm wandering around my house. I'm about to settle into some work, getting in the zone. And I sort of turn the corner into my kitchen to make a cup of tea. And there in front of me is my gorgeous little cat. And in front of him is this massive mouse. It was not a vibe, okay? It was not a vibe. So I'm looking at this scene and I'm thinking, oh my God, it's very much alive. The mouse is very much alive. And of course, like what's happening is the mouse is sitting in front of him, scared to move, because when the mouse moves, the cat will then sort of attack it and play with it and stuff. Oh God, it's such a wee murderous soul. Anyway, but just to let you understand, I have been in this scenario before and I didn't do very well. So the last time he did this with the mouse, what happened was the mouse came in, except he had chased it under the couch. Then I was trying to get out from under the couch. Then the mouse was running around my house. It was in the bathroom. It was in all my rooms. The mouse was everywhere. And I could not contain the mouse. And every time the mouse moved, I would get, I'm sure lots of people, maybe it's just me, but a lot of people could relate to this, is when the mouse moves or breathes, you get that kind of like, you scream for some reason. I don't know why. Just the mouse being alive kind of would bring tears to my eyes, right? I just get so upset about the mouse being in my world. And I couldn't catch it. I didn't know how to touch it. I just couldn't. So I trapped it in a room and I called my partner to come and rescue me, right? Damsel in distress style. And he came, thank goodness for him, my personal hero, and he managed to get the mouse out of my house and threw it over the fence of the garden. So that was last time. It was drama of the highest order. Now this time, what surprised me was that I didn't panic, right? So it's Friday morning, my partner is well and truly at work. He's not coming to rescue me. There is no one who can rescue me. I could probably go and speak to a neighbour, but I didn't want to bother them. And so I'm just there looking at this scene, and I don't know what came over me. I was calm and I came up with a solution to trap the mouse and get the mouse out of my house all on my own, without screaming, without crying, without being a total pork chop like I was in the past. And so I don't know what came over me, but for some reason I just could see the solutions in that moment, and there was no one else to help me, and I just rose to the challenge, and it actually was fine, and I sorted it out, and it wasn't as dramatic as all that. Now, you might think I was being completely ridiculous before, and I take your point. I definitely was, but that's just my natural reaction. I cannot help that I react that way. But this time was so, so different. And so that story, it happened on Friday, and it sort of brought to my attention that there was some change in me in those two scenarios. The same scenario approached slightly differently with a much better outcome, right? And I think the key lesson that I got from that I wanted to share with you guys was that when we are in a situation when we are forced to rely on ourselves and approach a scenario that we find deeply uncomfortable, provided we stay calm, we can sort that out, and you'll be surprised by what you have within you. So I wanted to bring this to the pod today because I think that all of you listening have the same ability inside you with all different scenarios. So Becc, what would you say to that? Have you seen this in your own life, or what do you think about when you hear that story?
Okay, firstly, very relatable. I'm going to sit up here on my ivory tower and be like, "Hey, a mouse, like, I can handle the mouse, totally." However, there are other things that I would have the exact same drama queen reaction to. Actually, my partner's been doing a lot of fishing lately, and the little fish that come off the rod, like, I can't seem to figure out how to pick them up and manage them. And I have the same kind of like irrational sort of fear response. And actually, lots of people have those kind of irrational responses in these unusual situations, don't we? And it's not until, as you're saying, there's nobody else around to save you, there's nobody else around to help you, that you'll actually manage it in a logical way. And up until that point that you have to rely on yourself, you can just kind of like, it's almost like Parkinson's law, like, which is you will use how much time you have. So Parkinson's law, the idea is that, for example, if you set aside 3 months to write a book, but you could have actually written that book in 2 weeks. Because you've set aside 3 months, you will expand the amount of work you do to fill up that 3 month time to write the book in no less than 3 months. It's sort of like that situation too, where we have another out, where you have someone else to save you or help you. You'll use those resources, you'll call those resources in, but you've got yourself in this situation here where suddenly you don't have any other mechanisms, any other options. And then you're left with me, myself, and I to work it out. And I think the message of this story is so profound and so, so useful. I think it's going to be an amazing reminder for all of you guys listening going into your week for literally anything that's coming up this week that is scaring you. Because I think my take on this is what Kristeen's just proved, which is you are so much more capable than you think. The things that scare you, the things that you are afraid of, you might just be overestimating in your mind as to how terrifying they are, and at the same time underestimating your ability to cope with them. That self-reliance that Kristeen's brought up, and I actually personally will benefit from this in my life this week too. So thank you so much for bringing it.
Absolutely. And I can think of so many different examples of times where this is helpful, and both in like doctor life and in your personal life. But something that came up for me even before this little mouse story happened that was top of mind is I was actually talking to one of the clinical exam candidates last week. And what I'm trying to do with the clinical exam candidates is encourage them to step into their consultant version of themselves, right? Their physician self. So it seems like a stretch until you're there. And I was trying to explain to them how, when they're answering questions in their discussion, one of the key things that they should do is try to imagine that they are the only doctor for this patient, right? They're it. Like, you put yourself in that. Of course, you can sort of recruit the opinion of whoever, but ultimately you're the physician, you're this person's doctor. What are you going to do? Because they're not working in that environment. They're working in a team-based environment, and they're not making the decisions in their day-to-day work. So it's about trying to put yourself in that scenario where where you do have to rely on your own smarts and what you actually think and communicate that. So that was it was a delightful little, the timeline of it was that was a theme for me last week as well. And then the mouse story was like holding a mirror up to myself and telling me to take my own advice kind of thing. But yeah, can you think of any other examples, Becc?
Straight away, actually, that is something that I used when I first started working as a registrar. When I started working as a registrar, I had obviously transitioned from being a resident, so resident to registrar. And it's a big jump to go from resident to registrar, because as a resident, you're not called to, it's not your job to make a lot of decisions and plans for patients. And yes, of course, you can expand or contract the scope of resident in as a wide range, but as a registrar, it is absolutely within your scope of work to drive the patient's care. And I actually used this with one of my clients too, who she was a BPT, and she'd stepped into a subspecialty role. And she felt a lot of imposter syndrome being the registrar in this subspecialty role. And it was oncology, actually, to be fair, which for those of you guys who have done oncology or if you work as an oncologist, you know that it's one of the most difficult specialties to do as a registrar, especially when you're not a trainee registrar, when you're a BPT. In my opinion, because all of the oncologists have very different, well, not all, well, a lot of the oncologists, with the oncologists that I've worked with, there's a great range of style of practice. So it's very difficult. Not only are you learning a very broad and complex field of oncology, but then you've got this extra layer of working with multiple different oncologists, 6+ at a time during your 1 week on the ward. And they all have different styles of practice, different tendencies, different opinions on all the nuances of different subjects. So it's quite hard to predict and get really good and efficient at predicting what would be the accepted or most likely taken path for any one consultant based on whichever patient you're taking care of. So we use this strategy of deciding to becoming the registrar who presents the plan not as a question mark, like, oh, I'd like to do this. I was thinking about doing this. Could we do this? But instead, within herself, making the plan herself and presenting it as if it's a done thing, as in, I'm going to do this. Or I would like to do this. I'm planning to do that. I've arranged for this. And this isn't for the point, this wasn't with the goal of her overstepping her scope or becoming overly confident or anything like that. But the whole point of this exercise was for her to make decisions for herself in advance before the consultant came along and solved the problem and made the decisions. I wanted her to, as you're saying, be her consultant self and actually go through that exercise of making those decisions. And she found the exact same thing again as you have found with the mouse scenario, putting it through that filter of, if I was the consultant here, what would I do? It actually sounds terrifying for a lot of us and inappropriate, irresponsible to take that attitude. But having that decision-making lens made her so much more productive. And it meant that she was able to drive forwards faster and learn more in the process. Because even when she got things wrong, we did a bit of coaching around that too, because obviously that's a lot of what holds us back apart from these ideas of it being irresponsible and or that you could do harm. They were all thought errors there, because when she was unsure, she would escalate to the consultant earlier. But that decisiveness and that mindset helped her make more decisions faster and not keep so many tabs open when she was working. So I really love this idea that you teach all your trainees about being your consultant self. And I think it's really important to offer people in medicine, because a lot of us tend to err on the side of being that humble and conservative and build our confidence before we let ourselves feel confident. But actually, in a lot of cases, if we can recruit this different style of decision making that's ahead of our rank, where we want to go instead of where we are right now, then we start to become that person more early. We start to learn the lessons early. We bring those lessons forward that we need to learn along the way to get there anyway.
And it's not a case of like performing like with your trainee and with that you were coaching and with my trainees. It's not a case of working outside your scope of practice. That's not what we're asking you to do. We're not asking you to actually be anyone else. But I think the key is what you said is it's almost like a conscious decision to create space for expansion, right? It's almost like as your little resident self, you're in this little fixed box. And it's about widening the box so that you yourself can open up and expand into it. It's still you, but it's just a kind of a bigger expression of you. You're taking up more room, you're having an opinion and you're backing yourself, rightly or wrongly. And that's what it's all about, is you're meant to do that so that you can compare your performance to who you're trying to be. And it is a safe space to do that, but it's a conscious decision to take up that space because the environment around you is not necessarily going to make you feel that way. It's going to make you feel like the little resident or med-reg or whoever you are in your working life. And to get to the next level, it is a choice to help yourself expand. Yeah.
Yeah. And on that note of, recognizing that it's not stepping out of your scope and actually that it's very productive on your learning, with your learning, you think about how, if you're in that moment where you're seeking out your feedback, i.e., you're running the plan that you're going to execute by your consultant. If you just asked a question, I'd like to go with this treatment, or what treatment should we go with, is the open-ended question. You're presenting that to your consultant. And they say, let's go with treatment A. That feedback isn't as obvious in that moment that you were wrong because you hadn't picked a team. Whereas if you had said, I'd like to run with option B. What do you think? And they come back and they say, oh no, option A. Then you have this nice, more narrow scope of information to take in, which is why A over B? It's very clear that you picked B, and now you can work out what led you to B instead of A. And that's just a much more striking way, I think, to take on that feedback, as opposed to being like, oh, I didn't really have an opinion. You can even trick yourself into being like, oh yeah, I probably would have picked A too. But actually you would have picked B. So I think it also hastens up that learning process. It's not something that is dangerous or push you outside of the scope, outside of your scope of work. It is purely used as a decision-making tool and then a feedback tool for yourself. It's a learning process. It's a productivity and learning process for you that is really an unfair advantage, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is delightfully uncomfortable when you first start to do it, but you'll see other people around you doing it and you'll be like, yeah. They're no different from me. They're just showing up in this slightly different way and approaching this in a more self-assured manner. Absolutely. I love it. And something that we had talked about in our little brainstorm bit was a really good point that you made about applying this to situations that scare us more generally. If we are in the clinical setting, I think we all have, I mean, I personally have a list of things that if you drop me into that situation, I'm going to be like, oh, I don't feel like I'm the best person. Obviously, right now as a consultant, I mainly am in clinic prescribing ACE inhibitors, right? So you drop me into a medical emergency, and of course I have some skills to call upon, but I'm just going to be really honest and say there are definitely other people around that see that more often and would be a lot more prepared for that scenario, right? So that's something that the more I become in outpatient land, the more that medical emergencies are quite distant from me, and you feel like you need to be refresher course if you knew you were going to have one that day. But I guess for when I was a trainee, I certainly had these things like seizures or strokes or even heart attacks or something. And especially when you're in a rural environment, those things would just terrify me on the daily. The thought of getting them on a shift, and I think this concept that we're talking about, where not going outside of your scope of practice, but understanding that you have a lot of tools within you and you have a lot of capability already, and being able to remain calm and apply those skills in those situations. I think that if we can tap into the knowing of that, it can be really powerful. Can you draw on any of your experience in that, or what would you say to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you as a med reg, it's terrifying the first time you go and do, these night cover shifts where you're like, it's just me in the whole hospital. Of course, that's not actually true, but you feel like you're the med reg for the night. You have to deal with anything that comes up, and depending on which hospital you're working in, you have a varying range of medical specialties in hospital versus on call in another hospital to actually help you. And this is common for my clients as well. I've got people who work in ONG, which to me, like I look at ONG and that just terrifies me in general now, because I haven't done ONG since I was a medical student. So when they talk to me about the ONG emergencies, I'm like, oh my goodness. And there's babies involved. It's always high risk and things like that. But my clients who do those on-call or night shifts themselves as well, GPs who are going to do urgent care, where urgent care might not always be a part of their regular practice. Like a lot of doctors, dare I say most doctors these days, we're getting more and more specialized. So more and more doctors are becoming more and more adapted to their particular specialty, GPs included. They're becoming adapted to their subspecialty areas that they're working in as a GP. And then suddenly they'll be rostered on or opt into some urgent care where they might get or might anticipate that they'll get a very different range of presentations that they might have to deal with quite urgently. Then you've got even just people locuming in general, going to different hospitals, and GPs locuming as well. So this comes up everywhere in medicine, where we're anticipating all these genuine scenarios, very possible scenarios that do terrify us. And I think it's not uncommon in my experience, both with my clients, with my colleagues, and just in general, it's very common for us as doctors to have that level of fear associated with lots of different scenarios we go into. And it's very common for me to coach my clients on these very situations. And an analogy that I've come up with is of the thing we fear being fog. So I actually remember driving up over, my partner and I were doing a road trip in Victoria, and we were driving up over one of the North Mountains. It's a super famous mountain, but I'm so bad with names. If I had the opportunity to name drop ever in my life, I wouldn't be able to. I just forget everybody's name. And I've forgotten this poor mountain's name as well. But anyway, we're at the peak of the mountain. And I was looking into, maybe I shouldn't use this analogy actually, because I'm not sure if it was fog or a cloud.
I feel like fog's all right. Yeah.
So the analogy is, I'm just worried they might physically behave differently. Anyway, so the analogy is that when we fear something, we tend to keep it at a distance from ourselves. Naturally, right? We're afraid of this thing. So we do what we can to keep it at a distance. And fog, when kept at a distance, can look extremely dense. If you're standing back hundreds of meters away from this cloud of fog, it almost looks opaque. It looks completely opaque in many scenarios. And that same opaque cloud of fog, as you start to walk towards it or drive towards it, becomes more and more transparent the closer and closer you get to it. And this is what I find happens with my clients when we work through fears as well. So counterintuitively, I will often take my terrified clients that come into me and they're like, I'm terrified of this scenario. I don't want to do this thing. I'm going to be terrible at this, all the fear. And what I will do, to their absolute delight in these sessions, is ask them to walk themselves, lean themselves all the way into that fear, to the point that I want them to take me to the worst case scenario that their mind is imagining. And let me just tell you, what I noticed with this too is they really have to sit back and kind of explore and work out what they really think the worst case scenario is, because it's usually sitting just below their awareness. They've kept that fog at a distance. They're not even sure exactly what they're afraid of. They've got the first sort of ideas have come up into their consciousness. And then with those little snippets, that fear is already coming, and they're like, whoa, 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 keep that away from me. Keep that stuff away from me. So first, I ask them to go to the worst case scenario, and they describe it to me. And then I ask them to take their next step. If they were in that worst case scenario, what would they do? I ask them to take that step towards the fog. And there has not been one scenario yet where my clients have said, well, I would just lay down and die. That would be the end of me. I would give up. I would be done. I don't know. And hey, maybe they'll give me a tokenistic no, but they know that they're not allowed to tell me they don't know in these sessions. So that will quickly be followed by a response. And as they start to tell me these responses, they start to perk up as well, because they're like, I would do this. I would do this. And to me, they've just walked themselves to the fog that looked dense. It looked unmanageable from far away. They look at that density and they're like, well, I'm a human being, that I'm a mass that cannot penetrate through this opacity. But as they walk closer and closer, the fog becomes more transparent, i.e., what they need to do next. The next step is revealed in itself. Every step you take, you step into the next bit of fog that is more transparent, and the next step is revealed. That's exactly what we do when we give ourselves a chance. This is exactly what you were talking about with the self-reliance, isn't it? That when you were put in the scenario, when you walked up to the scenario, you just started working it out. Even though last time your partner managed it for you, you were like, whoa, I would never be able to do that.
Exactly. And I love, oh my God, I love the fog analogy. It makes so much sense. And I guess it feels like there's two components. Well, I can see two, but maybe you can see more. It feels like there's two components. I guess one is staying calm. So that's where your solutions are. And the other is what you're saying is stepping in towards it, like literally walking in and leaning towards it. And sometimes when we're dropped into that situation, we can't help but lean towards it. But then there will be other times in your life where you're getting that choice of whether you want to walk towards it. But walking towards it, as you say, you might even get the calm in that because you're committing to trying, you're committing to showing up and doing the thing. So I feel like being calm and leaning in to whatever scares you, the fog, are the two key elements. And then the trust will just come, because when you're there, like you say, when you arrive at that destination, you will figure it out. You figure something out. You'll be able to do something. Like, is it as simple as that, Becc? Is there more to it?
I think you've said that really beautifully. Just one step reveals the next. Sometimes we intellectualize our fears so much, and instead taking action towards what we fear ironically makes us more calm, because we realize that what we were fearing wasn't so terrifying after all. We realize that after one step just comes the next. It becomes obvious to us how to take the next step when you're actually there in the scenario. But when you're intellectualizing the scenario, when you're keeping it at a distance, it's not so obvious. You have like 100 steps to work out intellectually in the process, as opposed to just putting yourself in the process. And this is something that I have to do with myself over and over again as a med reg who I haven't settled myself into one specialty where I get to have that, build up that certainty and that competence, that repetition in these problems, but instead staying as a medical registrar that works across all the different specialties, or in general medicine, just everybody in general medicine. There are so many things that I have the opportunity to avoid doing, and there are certain conditions that I try to keep my distance from. I let that be a dense fog over there. And I'm starting to learn slowly. Most recently, I've done this with stroke, where there are the options to take on stroke holds, when you're doing admitting shifts or when you're doing cover shifts. And often now I actually happen to work with a second med reg. So it's not just me taking everything. But I notice now that I actually want to take those stroke calls more, because in my mind, I've finally associated the idea that the more I do it, not only will I work it out as I go, like even if I'm standing here, I'm like, I don't have all of the things I need to know to do the A plus excellent job with this call. I also know that if I put myself in that scenario, I have the tools and resources to work it out. I just need to actually execute on it. And when I do that, that's another rep for me. It's another rep of building that competence. This is very different. As much as that might sound obvious, this is very different from an earlier version of a registrar that I've been, where I've just thought, I'm not capable of managing that. I haven't done that before, so I shouldn't be the person to manage it. I haven't done that before, so I can't work it out. But instead, recognizing that doing it is how you work it out. Moving towards your fear is how it is actually more likely to reveal that you can do it and you don't need to be afraid of it, rather than confirming your fear.
Yes, and then taking that another step further, like as you step into it and as you go through that transformation of the two different registrars that you just described, you'll actually change your identity and you'll become the person who does know how to handle a stroke. And that wouldn't have been your identity before, but it will become your identity. And now I am the person who can remove a mouse from my home. I mean, it's all happening. I've really transformed over here. But like, I didn't know that about myself. I know it's such a silly example, but I thought that I was the girl who just had a nervous breakdown at the very sight of a mouse, right? Like, and I think we can all relate to those examples in our lives. And by doing what you say, walking towards the fog, understanding that you're scared, but just doing it anyway, taking a step at a time, relying on what you have, and showing up and doing it, you will literally change your identity to the person who's now capable of standing in that fog. And I think that's just such a beautiful piece of progress to have.
Absolutely. And it just fits so well with your trainees right now going through these exams. And they do not have the competence of a consultant. They don't. Like, it's a really hard position to be in. But to choose to show up in a way, thinking like a consultant, is the closest you're going to get to making those great decisions. It's doing that thing that you're afraid of and you don't feel capable of that actually moves you towards it. And I think one of the most important lessons from this mouse in the house example and from all of my medical examples is just that in most cases, our fear in the first place was just a lie. The idea that this was something that we should be afraid of, that we wouldn't be able to manage, that was actually a lie in the first place. It's not true just because it feels true. It's not true just because you feel real fear. That emotion, totally valid, yes. But it doesn't make this fortune telling, this future predicting that we're doing true.
Oh my goodness, I feel like that is the perfect way to finish. Oh my goodness, mic drop moment from Dr. Becc. Oh my goodness, what a great conversation. Thank you so much, Becc, and thank you to everyone who is listening. If you have an example of a mouse in your house and how you overcame it, it'll probably happen to me in future. Give me some tips below, or anything that scares you that you overcome. Are you walking towards the fog? Let us know with some emojis below. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, guys. Walk towards the fog one step at a time. It'll become clearer and clearer what you need to do.
We'll see you next week. Bye.